Chris, you have a wonderful new book out with a terrific and very compelling title, Putinomics. Tell us a little about it.
Well, the question the book tries to answer is what motivates economic policymaking in Putin's Russia. And one of the things that Westerners and Americans often presume when they look at Russia is that Russia has the same goals as we do, and Putinomics has the same goals as American economic policy might have. But when you look at the way the Kremlin structures its economic policy, their number one goal isn't producing economic growth or improving living standards for the population. It's retaining power at home, first of all. Secondly, deploying it abroad. And thirdly, after that, is making sure that they have the resources they need domestically to achieve the first and second goals.
It's a fantastic premise, and I think absolutely right. The only thing I would add, and perhaps it's folded into your first point, is that a principal objective, I would guess, of Putinomics is the enrichment of the oligarchs themselves. Let's turn to post-Putin. Can you imagine Putin ever giving up power willingly?
Well, here's the dilemma, is no one can imagine it, and no one either abroad or in Russia itself knows what it would look like. The dilemma for any dictator is that after you've obliterated the rule of law, after you have a track record of leaving your opponents dead, is that you don't feel comfortable giving up power. And that's where Putin is today.
Exactly. And you know, this has been the Russian dilemma in so many ways, over so many centuries. You know, I always say about Russia, they kind of roll the cosmic dice, and one time they get Ivan the Terrible, then they get Peter the Great. One time they get Stalin, then they get Gorbachev. I think those dice have landed on Putin, and he is, in my view, highly unwilling, exactly as you say, to depart absent exterior forces, and it's hard to see those being marshaled. How about North Korea? That's of the news. What is the Russian-North Korean relationship? It looks fairly amicable.
Well, if you listen to the Russians, they insist that they're opposed to a nuclearized Korean peninsula. They want the North Koreans to give up their nuclear weapons. But the reality is that they don't fear North Korean nuclearization like we do or the South Koreans do. They realize that if North Korea is going to use any of its weapons, it's going to be not against them, but against other countries in the region. And they see North Korea as a place where they can insert themselves and get involved in regional politics in a way that will enhance their standing in the region and force the United States to negotiate with them.
And I suppose that as you kind of put it all together, some people these days are fond of saying that we're back in the Cold War. From a military perspective, I reject that. As in, I'm old enough to remember the Cold War when we had millions of troops facing each other on a hair trigger alert across the Fulda Gap, hundreds and hundreds of battleships operating around the world, 2 nuclear arsenals on a 1 second to launch structure. We're not there yet, but we're edging in that direction. How does it look from your perspective, Chris?
Well, certainly from the political and the diplomatic side, relations are the worst they've been since the Cold War. You can certainly put it that way. And the question from our end is, how did it get so bad? And why weren't we able to predict that it was going to go in this direction? Because if you rewind the clock just a couple of years when Obama launched his reset policy, or before that under the George W. Bush administration, there was a fair amount of optimism about what we could accomplish with Russian partners. And that proved to be mistaken, in part because we misunderstood what Russia's goals are and the tools they're willing to use to achieve those goals. So from our perspective, the question is, what did we misinterpret and why did we get the Russians so wrong?
Yeah, I agree with that. And speaking of President Bush, I'm always mindful that he was very impressed with Vladimir Putin. In fact, gave a famous press conference where he said, you know, I looked into Vladimir's eyes and I saw his soul. And of course, a year or so later, John McCain kind of famously was asked the question, well, you've met Putin, you've looked in his eyes, what did you see? McCain said, I saw 3 letters, KGB. And I think McCain probably got that one more right than wrong. And I think this is a good example that personality and people drive history in many ways. Sometimes there are bigger forces, but often it's personal. And I think that's part of the calculus. Well, we can't stop a conversation with one of the great Russian experts in the nation, like you, without asking about a book recommendation. So in addition to Putinomics, what's a wonderful book for someone to read to help understand Russia?
When people are asked that question, they often think about the great Russian novels to understand Russian culture. I would actually point towards a work that helps you understand the Soviet mentality and look at the recent Nobel Prize winner, Svetlana Alexievich, who's written a series of books that chronicle the post-Soviet mentality. How did people think in the late Soviet period and afterwards? Because when you look at Russia today, yes, it's the continuation of centuries of Russian culture, but in some ways more significant is that it's the wreckage of the Soviet Union, which really shapes how Russian elites and the Russian people see the world around them.
And the book that was cited in the Nobel Prize was Lost Time?
Secondhand Time.
Secondhand Time. It depends how you translate it. It is a marvelous book, and I've read it, and I join you in that recommendation. But I'm going to add a novel to it, because I do think you could put a novel alongside Secondhand Time, which is Gogol's Lost Souls, which I think takes you back to the Tsars and makes some of the same points that she does in her absolutely magnificent book. So there's a pair of recommendations we have between us. Chris, thanks for taking time.
Thank you.